And by way of introduction, I'll show you my version of a slide you've seen already, that the processing of food, which isn't just heating, but any processing, can generate chemicals in that food that are not normal nutrients, some of which have been associated with toxicological effects. And we've seen the identity of some of these that have raised concerns over the last few years. The acrylamide, furans. We historically have been concerned about polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heterocyclic aromatic amines, 3-MCPD and its esters, and of course nitrosamines. And last year, ILSI Europe published a stepwise approach to assess the application impact of mitigation measures of some of these process-formed chemicals. But this was a reactive strategy. In other words, one identified the presence of acrylamide or furan in food and then asked the question, what can we do about it, if anything? And this was a stepwise approach to evaluate that. And what ILSI North America decided was that we need a proactive approach. So they developed this draft decision tree, as you heard by the ILSI-NA Technical Committee on Food and Chemical Safety, and their member scientists wanted to start a discussion around the concept of a framework to evaluate the impact of mitigation and to assess the true impact on risk caused by process-formed compounds, and taking a very holistic view that we shouldn't restrict ourselves just to those analytes that somebody happened to have found, but ask more broadly the question, what is the actual risk of these process-formed compounds in our diet, and what is possible in terms of risk mitigation amongst the myriad strategies one could think about. And this is something similar you've seen already. I'm just putting some specifics on it. And what I'm going to do now is step you through each of the individual parts of the decision tree and discuss some of the issues that we have to consider and some of the tools that are available to us to address those issues. And I think it's probably fair to say right now that there's, and the point has been already made this morning, that this is not a simple activity. It's going to involve immense effort by numerous disciplines to get to the end of this process. And it will also involve the full engagement of not only risk assessors, but risk managers and other policymakers. So we start with problem formulation. And in this case, that means what is the list of process-formed toxicants based on available information that we have to worry about? And we've heard that we've identified some of them, but this is, we know, the tip of the iceberg. There are various databases that the chemists have put together, the so-called MIARD database, which currently lists at least 550 different compounds produced as a result of the MIARD reaction on the heating of foodstuffs. In addition, heating lipids produce at least 200 other compounds. So we now have our list of 770, pushing 800 compounds. And we know that at least 50 of these are potential hazards. They cause toxicological effects when animals are exposed to them. And what about other process-dependent chemistries? We've already heard that heating is not the only chemistry we're worried about. There's, of course, other processing strategies such as irradiation, but many others as well. And as we become more innovative, we're going to find the introduction of new chemistries, and I would suggest we're going to introduce the new process-formed chemicals. So whilst it's true that we've been cooking our food over a flame for 1 million years, I heard one estimate, we have not been using all of the process chemistries we're currently using today. So we are introducing some new chemicals, I suspect. So having identified our list of chemicals, we have to establish criteria for when these compounds are high risk. So what are the compounds of potential concern? And you heard this morning about this problem of the balancing hazard versus risk, etc. And I thought about this and I came to the conclusion that this is not an easy question. First of all, what is meant by high risk is essentially a policy question. It's not a scientific question. At this point in the decision tree, should this be a hazard-based conclusion or a risk-based one? Bearing in mind that risk requires consideration of hazard and exposure, So at this early point, if you're going to use it on risk-based strategy, you need exposure data as well. Could we use simply occurrence data and or toxic potency at this point? Can we agree potency cutoffs? We have some accepted potency limits or estimates for substances such as the reference values. You've heard about the tolerable daily intake, the reference dose, the ADI, the acute reference dose, etc. And although they're bright lines, they're a good starting point. Because another point I want to make here is that whilst I fully agree with everything that's been said about moving forward with the approaches we use to estimating risk in human populations and subpopulations, we should be using the accepted methodology for process compounds as we would use for other chemicals. In other words, there's nothing special about these in terms of the risk assessment. We should be using the general methodology. So if it's generally accepted a codex for the time being that a TDI is associated with an acceptable risk and it's safe, then I think that's a good starting point for these compounds as well. And of course, there's limit values as well, specific migration limits or maximum residue levels. What about substances with no accepted potency estimates? When we heard about some compounds where, some of the MCPD-related compounds where there is no reference value. Well, could we agree potency cutoffs based on points of departure for the two main categories of compound that Joe talked about, the genotoxic carcinogens and non-genotoxic compounds? And in fact, when you think about it, we have already done this in some areas, that we will not set reference values for pesticides which have a no effect level or a BMD above a certain value, because we just think there's not going to be a risk of any conceivable human exposure. But what about substances with little or no existing toxicological information? And this is going to be a real problem. And we know all about the efforts that have been put in to develop non-animal methods, so-called in silico and in vitro. And there was a publication last year from ILSI Europe by, first author was Benoit Schilter, which laid out a framework, and we have another one in preparation led by Bas Blabauer from the Netherlands, which is going to go through a sort of framework for how to integrate these non-animal methods into a decision approach for compounds with limited or no toxicological data. And of course, we would start with the chemical structure and think about whether there's something that we can use from analog read across. We know about the possibility of quantitative structure-activity relationships based on physical chemical descriptors, or I'm trying to blank, the Derrick type system, which is based on a rules-based approach. In vitro approaches like high throughput screening, where we're getting large amounts of information for multiple endpoints. High content analysis like various omics approaches, sophisticated cell culture models and medium throughput, and of course we know about the DARPA strategy and others who are trying to put a human tissue on a chip or a human organ on a chip. And all of these could potentially provide information either without any laboratory work, if it's in silico, or with in vitro approaches and non-animal testing to generate data that might be useful in ranking at least the compounds for their toxic potency. But it's not going to be easy, and I'm not giving any clear answers here. I'm just indicating directions in which people are thinking. So we've created a list of process form toxicants, and we've established criteria for when compounds are high risk. So we have to prioritize compounds for evaluation based on either the margin of exposure or some other assessment of risk, and then calculate the current, that is the pre-mitigation exposure for these high priority compounds. And thinking about this, that's the way the framework is expressed at the moment. You prioritize the compounds based on margin of exposure or something else, and then calculate the pre-mitigation exposure. The question is, where do you get the exposure data and when do you get it? And so an alternative is to calculate the exposure for high priority compounds based on hazard-based cutoffs and then prioritize the compounds for evaluation based on marginal exposure or other assessment of risk. And that's an open question that people will have to think about. But once we've prioritized the compounds based on the marginal exposure, we have to ask, does current exposure represent a health risk? Yes or no? And we've heard that the marginal exposure is actually potentially very useful. It's at least a method of ranking and prioritizing compounds, even if it doesn't give an absolute quantitative indication of the level of risk. And for non-genotoxic compounds, in general, they're interpreted the same as reference values. That is, they would be considered negligible concern when the margin of exposure is numerically greater than the uncertainty or safety factor that you would apply to the point of departure to establish a guidance value. And that's a fancy way of saying that if you've got a margin of exposure of 100 or more, everything else being equal, you would consider there was a low risk, and that was a value of low priority. Just as if you, and that's equivalent to saying if I took my critical point of departure divided by 100 and got an ADI or a TDI, and I was below that, I would consider there was marginal or there was trivial risk. For genotoxic compounds, there would be low concern, at least at JEC and EFSA, when the margin of exposure is greater than 10,000. But this is based on the potential assumption of a risk level of 1 in 10 to the 5, 1 in 100,000, which is 10 times above the 1 in 10 to the 6 the virtually safe dose is based on, and it's based on an implicit assumption of a linear dose-response relationship. And much has been made by those who have proposed the MOE approach for genotoxic carcinogens that it does not require any assumptions about the shape of the dose-response curve, which gets away from this linear low-dose extrapolation and the use of a virtually safe dose. Well, it gets away from putting a numerical risk value on your output. In other words, it could cause cancer in 1 in 10 to the 6 of the population, and everybody's looking around saying, well, where's that one person? But it doesn't get away from some of the implicit assumptions necessary. Other approaches are the threshold of toxicological concern for the different structural groups, for example, the Kramer classes 1, 2, and 3, and one might think of other ways of prioritizing compounds. So just a word about this issue of dose response and the interpretation of the margin of exposure. The European Food Standards Agency, European Food Safety Authority, sorry, EFSA, a few years ago now, had a workshop, and it put forward a proposal for the scientific justification of a margin of exposure of 10,000 being associated with low concern. And they argued that if you start with the animal BMDL10 for the cancer endpoint as the point of departure, you divide by the exposure, you get the margin of exposure, and if it's greater than 10,000, you're allowing 10 for for interspecies differences, 10 for human variability, an additional 10 for variability in DNA repair efficiency, and 10 for the fact you're using an effect level of 10% as opposed to 0%. And that will reach 10,000, which is a level for low concern. Most scientists present said this doesn't make a lot of sense to them. For example, you're essentially double counting human variability, because why would you split out variability in DNA repair efficiency from normal human variability? What's the evidence that that is something you need to add in? And if you argue you need 10 for using a BMDL10, then you destroy the whole basis of the risk assessment of non-genotoxic, non-carcinogenic compounds, because the BMDL10 is considered to be equivalent to the use of the no observed adverse effect level. And this, I thought, was a very extraordinary statement, because the implicit assumption here is, in some way, the no observed adverse effect level is a 0% response level, which we know is absolutely untrue. It may be, but it is frequently far from it. In fact, we did an exercise a few years ago as part of the EFSA BMD working group, and we came up to the conclusion that you could have up to 20% response at the NOEL in a typical OECD guideline study, non-cancer endpoints. And we just live with that. It's part of the way we do risk assessment. There's conservatism elsewhere that we believe allows for that. So the position at the present time is there's no generally accepted basis for the scientific interpretation of the margin of exposure of 10,000 plus being of low concern, although there's a gut feeling it probably is. So our colleagues and I put a proposal to the Food Standards Agency, the FSA in the UK, and said, if we're going to use this in the UK and in Europe, we probably should try to get some more secure scientific footing to this. And so we got funding to do a desk exercise to look at multiple lines of evidence as to how close do we get to a realistic estimate of risk in humans using 10,000. And we used, we eventually used 5 different lines of evidence, which I'm going to synthesize for you in one graph in a minute. But one of the lines of evidence was so-called mega cancer studies. Over the years, there have been 3 sets of mega cancer studies. That is, they're using huge numbers of animals. One used rats, one used mice, and one used trout fry. And trout fry was the biggest because you could culture very large numbers of organisms in a tank at one time and measure them. And this was a group in Canada, Bailey et al., and it's the most recent of these studies. And they used a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, dibenzoyl-pyrene, and they looked at the liver and stomach cancer. And there's a couple of points. One is that the incidence level they got to was still at least tenfold above the 1 in 10 to the 5, which is the incidence level in humans we're trying to get to with the margin of exposure. So we don't have experimental data at the level of human risk. That's a concern. And the second point is that whilst you might convince yourself that is a threshold, if you like, for the stomach cancer, you would be hard put to convince everybody that there is a true threshold there. There might or might not be. The problem is that data do not allow you to come to any conclusion on that because it's a question of power. And no study can be powered to satisfactorily answer this answer, not on observation alone. So we synthesized these 5 lines of evidence. And there was the 3 mega studies which we reanalyzed. And we used a way of expressing the data, which is the ratio, the rate of excess cancer versus the dose POD ratio. And that was to scale everything in exactly the same way. And up here we have the 3 studies in rat, mouse, and trout. Then we have here as 2 expert elicitation exercises where we asked about a generic question. That's the, here, which is the black horizontal line, which is what's the risk level of a genotoxic carcinogen in humans. And then these are 4 case studies that we ran, taking into account compound-specific information. And these are listed here: benzpyrene, the 2 alkylating agents, EMS and ENU, and aflatoxin. And then we had 2 groups of chemicals, which were this first group where there was established human carcinogens. And we had good data for epidemiology, where we knew the incidence of cancer at a given level of exposure in the human population. This turns out to be a very, very difficult piece of information to get. Very, very difficult. If you go to the epidemiological literature and you try to find out what is the actual exposure at a level of cancer incidence for these carcinogens, it's actually not often well represented. In fact, in 1 or 2 occasions, we had to use exposure estimates in parallel studies which weren't looking at cancer, but they were similar scenarios, so we were able to read across. And the final group were 3 compounds, and you heard about one of them, acrylamide, the other is ethylene oxide, and the other is tamoxifen, and we specified only liver for tamoxifen, which were clearly genotoxic carcinogens in animals, for which the epidemiological evidence to date does not show a statistically significant elevation of risk. And the current view is that the acrylamide data, as you heard, is not robust enough to determine whether or not there is an elevated risk in humans. And the acrylamide is shown here, and you can see the magnitude of the error bar. This is the confidence intervals. We just don't know one way or the other. There could be very, very low risk, or there could be actually quite an appreciable risk. We don't know. So this cross here is the target, 10,000, 1 in 10 to the 5. And the question is, how well informed is that by the data? Well, the first thing is there are no experimental or human data that get to this point. Even the human epidemiology, I mean, you're trying to estimate a risk of 1 in 10 to the 5. You won't get that in an epidemiology study. It's based on higher incidences, because you need to study 1 million people to get that. with a significant instance. And the second is that there is some indication that we are adequately protective using a margin of exposure of 10,000 for assuming linear extrapolation. But there's no uniform conclusion. In other words, there are some human carcinogens where the confidence interval cuts the line or is close to the line. There are others where it's below the line. And so the overall conclusion was that we still don't have a clear scientific justification for the interpretation of the margin of exposure, but it's likely that 10,000 is consistent with an upper bound risk of 1 in 10 to the 5. It's likely. And this is true, as Joe Rodrigues pointed out, that even for non-cancer endpoints, that if you go above the reference dose, then if you say that a reduction of exposure of 50% reduces risk by 50%, that's an implicit assumption of linearity. And of course, the dose responses are not linear. But we don't actually know what shape they are in humans. So that's another unknown. So does current exposure represent a health risk based on the exposure assessment? If it's no, well, obviously there's no need to evaluate mitigation plans, but there's nothing to mitigate. If yes, we have to think about how might we mitigate. What are the plans that we might implement? So consider the nature of the toxicant, its route or potential route of formation, because as we heard from acrylamide, some of the mitigation plans are aimed at interfering with the formation of the process compound. And if we think we might know how it's formed, then at least we could test the possibility that by interfering with the chemistry, we interfere with the toxicant of the compound. What are the main sources of exposure from the diet? Is it everywhere, like acrylamide, or is it in 1 or 2 foodstuffs, like some of the MCPD esters? What are the populations exposed and for how long? And what are the possible strategies for risk reduction? The 2 main ones are reduced exposure, either via altering consumption patterns or the occurrence in the food that's consumed. And of course, both strategies have been attempted with acrylamide. Another one is to mitigate the effect by an intervention strategy based, if possible, on understanding of the mode of action for the toxicity you're concerned about. So it might be that, for example, if you're interfering with some essential nutrient, you could offset that by adding something into the food. And there may be other strategies for risk reduction as well. And then select those potential risk reduction strategies that are both feasible and realistic. So what do we mean? Well, it's not realistic to ask everybody to stop eating meat within the population. So that's not going to be a realistic mitigation strategy. You've got to think about, well, how might they treat the meat to reduce the process-formed compounds that there's concern about. And that, of course, was what was done with the heterocyclic aromatic amines a few years ago. It was suggested that you cook the meat differently rather than on a hot metal surface, which is the root of the Maillard reaction. And feasible and realistic. Also, of course, there are economic considerations which go well beyond a scientific discussion, but will require consideration when considering which are the risk reduction strategies that are most appropriate. Then, having generated these plans and identified which you're going to go forward with, at least to consider, calculate post-mitigation exposure for each plan and combinations or rational combinations of possible mitigation plans. We heard for some of the examples this morning where it wasn't a single strategy that was proposed, but several different strategies. Determine the impact of the mitigation plan on the occurrence of the chemical using published literature, or estimate the impact based on assumptions, which of course have to be explicit. You need to state what assumptions you're making. So you might say, well, if I interfere with the formation of this intermediate that is involved in the production of my process compound in my foodstuff, and I take it down to 10%, I'm going to assume that at least 75% reduction. That's an explicit assumption without a measurement. Estimate the change in consumption of relevant food commodities, or potential change in the population. There's a lot of social science there where we know what impact dietary advice has on populations and different populations, and we can make conservative assumptions where we don't assume that when a government agency says, we recommend that you cut your intake of fatty food to 5% of what it is now, that everybody's going to do that. But we've got an idea of how much they will reduce it by. And for some recommendations, it's probably very little. And then calculate the exposure or estimate the exposure in the relevant populations. And as has been pointed out before, here and elsewhere in this, we need to identify the uncertainties and quantify them to the extent possible. Absolutely essential. So then we ask the question, does the post-mitigation exposure have a significant reduction in risk compared to the current exposure? And if yes, go off to another point of the tree, but if no, mitigation efforts are not recommended. In other words, we're making no difference. But how do we know, how do we judge whether there's a significant reduction of risk compared to current exposure? Well, we need to establish criteria for when compounds are still a high risk. And this is another ILSI activity. This was the Health and HESI branch, which developed the so-called Risk 21 roadmap and matrix. And there are 3 papers on this published so far, and we're going to publish some more. But this is a way, this part, the matrix, is a clear visual representation of the margin of exposure. It's a way of visualizing the margin of exposure. And so you have the hazard expressed on the y-axis and the exposure on the x-axis. And the important thing is this should be expressed in the same units. It could be external dose or exposure in mg per kg body weight per day, but it could be something more sophisticated like a predicted internal or target organ concentration. But they have to be the same. And then we plot the range of toxicity estimates and the range of exposure estimates for, in this case, different mitigation plans. So here's the current situation up here, and then these are different possibilities where we're changing either consumption or occurrence or some other strategy. And we have no bright line, but we have a rough idea of where we're trying to get to, a fuzzy area in the middle. And what this says is that if we're able to get down here, we're reasonably confident we've got to a point where there's no concern. But if we're up here, we're reasonably confident there is a real concern. If we're in the middle, we're going to have to think about it very carefully. And so this allows us to rank the impact of our mitigation plans. And so here we can see that if we go to plan E, it's clearly having a big impact and would be highly desirable if it's feasible and realistic. Let's say we didn't have E, but we had only these 3, then you would be saying, well, D is probably preferable to B and C, but we might need to discuss some of the finer details of these 3 as well in terms of their cost and implications. And this is now a web-based tool that's going to be made freely available to anybody who wants to use it. So the definition of significant reduction, again, is a policy decision. How much do we have to reduce risk to consider a mitigation plan has achieved something worthwhile, or where we consider we shouldn't be bothering? So where there's a health-based guidance value or a limit value existing, reducing exposure to below those values would be considered a significant reduction. In other words, oops, am I going the right way? Yeah. In other words, if I've got a TDI and it's here, then clearly by getting exposure below the TDI, I've produced a significant reduction in risk. And I think most people would accept that. And similarly, achieving a margin of exposure above those associated with a low level of concern, which would be everything being equal, 100 for a non-carcinogenic or non-genotoxic compound, and 10,000 if you use the Codex approach for genotoxic compounds, this would also be considered a significant reduction. And similarly, reducing exposure to below a respective TTC value would be considered significant. So all of these give you a scientifically defensible conclusion that the reduction is significant. And risk managers might set other risk mitigation goals. So they might say, if you can reduce exposure by 75%, then that would be a real achievement. And if they were then achieved, that would be considered a significant reduction. In other situations then, mitigation efforts would not be recommended because we haven't achieved a significant reduction. If the mitigation exposures have achieved a significant reduction by these criteria, then we evaluate the secondary effects of mitigation efforts. And this is where risk-benefit considerations come in. We might increase or introduce additional risks. We could think about certain cooking practices which increase the probability of microbial contamination. We could change the toxicant profile of the food. We could change its nutrient quality. There could also be undesirable changes in consumption patterns overall. There could be changes in the organoleptic qualities of the food, making it less acceptable to the population, despite the fact of providing some important nutrients. There could be a switch to less healthy and or nutrient-poor foods, and of course the cost to the consumer of the mitigation efforts. It's very likely that if this is an expensive process, the consumer will eventually be the one who's paying. And so if it costs a lot of money to make coffee with lower acrylamide levels, you're going to be asked to pay more money for your coffee. And then people might switch to something else like gin. We've evaluated the secondary effects of mitigation efforts. We need to establish criteria for evaluating the overall risk when we're considering both the primary and the secondary effects of mitigation, and then determining what's the overall health risk when considering these secondary effects along with the primary effects. And to determine the impact of these secondary effects of risk mitigation plans, we're probably going to need composite metrics to determine the likely overall effect. And schemes for the analysis of risk and benefit together may be of value. And you heard about the BRAFO approach, which I was involved in. That was an EU-funded project. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And the options include quantifying the extent of risk reduction for the magnitude and or incidence of effects on health outcomes, or from composite health metrics. And so the BRAFO approach, which was a framework, I think 6 funded project coordinated by ILSI Europe, ran in parallel with an EFSA working group on risk benefit. And in the good old days, it was possible for close cooperation at that time between ILSI Europe and EFSA. And there was cross-membership of the 2 working groups. And the methodology developed in BRAFO was used as a fundamental part of the proposals that EFSA came up with for the risk-benefit strategy as well. And so there's really not much difference between those approaches. And we came to the conclusion that it was necessary to use a tiered approach. And I won't go into this in detail. It's all in the papers that we've published on this. The methodology was published in 2012, but there are other papers using case studies as to how this would be implemented. But at the higher tiers, you see we get to the point of using so-called common health metrics, QALYs or DAILYs. And as we go up to the highest tier, you can use a probabilistic approach. And there's a more sophisticated method developed by a sister project to this called Calibra, who developed an online tool for doing probabilistic assessments in risk-benefit. And so the QALY, or the DALY, or DAILY, is based on this idea that you can weight different health states. And you need to take account of both the weighting of the health state and the duration in which you're in that health state. So here's a typical here is an individual who is healthy by the norms of the day for so many years, and then develops prostate cancer. And so we need to know what was the age at which this occurred, so how many years of healthy life, and then age of onset, and then what is the quality weight you would give to prostate cancer. And there are 2 approaches to this, depending on whether you're using a QALY or a DAILY. The QALY uses the patient's weighting of living with a particular health state, and the DALY uses health professionals' weighting of how the weight you would give to a particular health state. They're very similar, but not the same. And then you live for so many years with this health state, and then you die, and you have the age of death, but sometimes that is premature, and the individual would be expected to live so many further years, so they have a life expectancy of LE. And this can be put into an equation, and these are just the inverse of each other, essentially, and this is the quality-adjusted life years and the disability-adjusted life years, and so you just calculate these values. And so this is a so-called composite metric. It takes account of health state and duration of health state. But there's something that's not been implemented here, and as far as I know is not widely implemented at all, but is a possibility, which is when you think of the area of nutrition, we're thinking not only of negative health states, but positive health states. In other words, we're improving the quality of life. And so you can move above 1, because you're moving above the norm that's expected for that individual. And so you could actually have positive weightings and durations of a positive health state with that weighting. One of the great difficulties is if you're using animal data or non-human data for the toxicological effects, how do you get the weightings? And that is a difficult area. But this is an approach that does allow us to get into the risk-benefit at higher tiers. So we then conclude that the overall health risk when considering the impact of the secondary effect is either positive, in which case we would have an impact of the mitigation and would therefore recommend that mitigation effort. Or it's negative, and then we would therefore not recommend the mitigation effort. But what is negative and what is positive? Again, this is a policy decision, although there are situations where it's implicit. So where all of the relevant exposures are below the respective levels of concern, so no adverse health effect on health would be anticipated, clear recommendations can be made. I've put above here because some of the relevant exposures might be essential nutrients. When you're going into secondary risks, there might be a switch to a food which is nutrient poor and you're losing a micronutrient. You have to be above the level of that micronutrient to be without a health effect. Where there is potentially a net negative impact on health, the secondary risks lead to potentially greater effect on health than mitigation, or where there's potentially a net positive effect on health, but there are some secondary negative health impacts, you would either conclude that the overall health risk is positive, based on a priori criteria, which you've agreed with the risk manager, or you can communicate all the relevant information with the estimates of uncertainties to the risk manager to discuss the options, which is another way of saying, it's your problem, make up your mind, is what you want to do now. And we did see that with, I think it was furan, where it wasn't possible to reach a conclusion on the basis of the present information. If the post-mitigation exposure has no significant effect on risk compared to current exposure, or the overall health risk when considering the impact of secondary effects is negative, mitigation efforts are not recommended. But there is still a problem. There is an exposure which is of potential concern. It's just we cannot think of a conceivable mitigation strategy to reduce the risk. So what we have to do is think about if any new technological advances are introduced, could they create the opportunity to introduce or improve mitigation efforts? And if so, we would have to reevaluate the impacts on exposure and go through the whole system again at that time. So that's the scheme. I hope I've provided some information on how it's likely to operate and some of the issues involved, and I do look forward to a productive discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks for the great talks. Andy Mayer from the University of Cincinnati. I wonder if you've well published and very involved in mode of action, and I wondered if you'd commented on how that may or may not fit in well with this overall process.
So thank you. One of the things that I think mode of action helps us do is to understand what is the margin of exposure that we would consider to be associated with low or negligible risk. And that would be true, I think, in my view, for not only non-carcinogenic compounds, but for non-genotoxic or even carcinogens as well. So if we can understand the mode of action, it tells us, it informs what is the margin of exposure we're trying to achieve, that we would consider to be a significant reduction in harm, or even a reduction to the point of where there is no real concern at all. And so if we could switch from having to worry about a margin of exposure of 10,000 or 100,000 for a compound that is carcinogenic in rats, but the mode of action makes it very clear that this is secondary to some other disturbance of physiology or biochemistry, and that it would be sufficient to get a margin of exposure of 100 or more, then that immediately changes the whole feasibility of some mitigation measures.
There's a story going around of 30 years ago when we were considering our constituents' policy. The chief counsel of FDA was asked, why 1 in a million? And his answer was, because you don't say to your sweetheart, baby, you're 1 in 100,000. But you know, now you are considering 10 to the 5 or 10 to the minus 5. And I'm asking, and some people use 10 to the minus 6. What's your rationale for 10 to the minus 5? Is this for EFSA or JECFA or across the pond, in other words? What is the rationale?
Well, as I was trying to point out, I don't think there is a good scientific rationale. It was just a number that people felt comfortable with, and it is EFSA and WHO. You know, that's the two groups that are using it at the moment, and WHO means JECFA and others reporting into Codex. It is genuinely a policy question. What is considered a societally acceptable risk? If you make the assumption that there is no threshold, and let's say it's likely to be linear as a worst case, what is the acceptable risk? There's no scientific answer to that.
No, and I thought our chief counsel's answer was not too bad, actually. I call it, sounds good, I call it euphonic risk management.
But
okay? So what's euphonic about 1 in 100,000?
No, well, we don't call it 100,000. We just call it 10,000.
Well, I mean, that's a different.
I know, semantics. But one of the misconceptions is that it's somewhere in a population of 1 million, one of them is going to get cancer, and of course that's not what that VSD means, or any load of. It means that aggregated across the entire population, there's an increased risk of whatever it is, nominally, and it could be that 1 million people get cancer one increment of time shorter than they would have done otherwise.
No, after we chose 1 in a million, okay, other people later on had some little time to think about this, not Europe, but like California, and they came up with 10 to the 5 or whichever number, you know, whatever, and so did EPA, certain parts of EPA. So, you know, my understanding from talking over refreshing beverage in the evening with people who did this, they realized that 10 to the minus 6 was going to get them in a world of hurt, okay? Okay, and that by going to 10 to the minus 5, they could deal with the substances that were really problematical and not be in a world of hurt.
But I do think
is that the rationale for WHO?
I think it possibly was, but I think this is a very, very important issue for this decision tree, which is, I think for the non-carcinogenic compounds, we'll probably reach a consensus as to where we're trying to get to. For the genotoxic carcinogens, I think it's going to be more difficult, because if we're saying that we're going to tolerate in food a genotoxic carcinogenic compound at a certain level, but we believe that level is of low risk, that's just going to open up a big debate. And I don't think we should fix to 10,000 as a margin of exposure. It has to be a discussion with all relevant stakeholders and agree a value. The scientists can then say, we know where we are relative to that value. But we don't decide the value. In my view.
I've been wondering a lot about how perception is reality, and there's some really interesting work going on in life sciences that suggests that that is actually a more important factor in understanding even some physiological processes than we ever realized. And I'm wondering how much you've thought about that, in terms, because there's all this, policy decision making, really is about perception as well as science. And it just seems to me that it would be really interesting to get a better sense of whether someone felt like their quality of life was being improved by mitigating a risk, that they might actually be experiencing a mitigation of risk. And I am not aware that anyone's really even tried to look at that yet, but I think it's something that we need to consider.
Well, it's something quite close to my heart at the moment because of another role I have. And one of the questions we're currently facing is what's the risk to airline crew of fume events long term? And there's a school of thought that a significant, if not all of that, is due to perception and not to chemical toxicity. Difficult to prove, but there are data to suggest that is a very real possibility. Not that it is happening, but it's a very real possibility. There are behavioral scientists who've taken volunteers and induced very severe physiological disturbance because of a perception of harm, which is absolutely zero because the stimulus they're exposed to is totally innocuous, but they believe is harmful. So my view is that this is just as much an impact on quality of life as a chemical cause. But the strategy for dealing with it probably should be different. Because if we just take out the one chemical that everybody believes is causing the problem, they will switch to something else. So I think the strategy has to be more than just, well, let's remove the chemical that everybody's saying is bad for you, and that will cure the problem. In this case, the root cause is different, and we have to think of alternative strategies. But we certainly shouldn't ignore it. It's obvious that this is a serious problem. You see it in, Simon Wesley has looked across 150 years of armed conflict and says the profile of illness in stress-related illness in soldiers is exactly the same in the Gulf War as it was in the Boer War. And he thinks that it's psychological. But he says, don't mistake me saying that this isn't a real problem for these people. They're seriously ill. The same with some of the pesticide workers. We had the sheep dip problem in the UK with diazinon and others. There's no evidence that this is a chemical cause, but it's a very real debilitation.